Hello, today I want to talk about Nintendo, really shaking things up. They've changed a lot over the years in how they handle their projects, and in the modern day, Nintendo themselves don't actually make that much. So I want to talk through what's changed and why many smaller franchises can only exist with third parties like Star Fox and F-Zero and Metroid. So grab your ears, grab your eyes, and listen and watch. In the past, Nintendo would pump out sequels to all their major properties, like Mario, Zelda, and Donkey Kong, while also creating brand new IP and juggling the heavy hitters with the crowd pleasers. This was during the 80s and 90s, where pretty much everything was developed in-house spread across multiple teams. There was R&D 1, who made Game & Watches, the Game Boy, and a bunch of legacy IP like Excitebike, Metroid, Kid Icarus, and Wario Land. R&D 2 were more console-focused and were responsible for the NES and the Super Nintendo, but also a few minor ports like Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Donkey Kong 3 on the NES. R&D 3 made future hardware like the N64, the GameCube, and the Wii, and also franchises like Punch-Out both in their arcade and console forms. There's also smaller IP like Star Tropics. Finally, R&D 4, who, despite being the furthest numerically, is one of the most prominent studios. We're talking Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, F-Zero, and so many more significant franchises. So back then, R&D 1 and R&D 4 made most of the big and small franchises most gamers gravitate towards. I mean, all of them played a vital role in keeping both software and hardware constantly flowing through the 8-bit, 16-bit, and 64-bit eras, but many of the classics come from R&D 1 and R&D 4. But something would change with the N64. The old way of having Nintendo develop all these franchises in tandem was starting to wane. With Game Boy's development costs being much lower, it could pick up some of the slack, but franchises people came to expect, like Metroid, wouldn't make their 3D debut until the following generation, and it wasn't done by Nintendo. Many third parties skipped the system entirely in favor of the PlayStation, and so much of Nintendo 64's output was saved by Rareware. Rare did the Donkey Kong Country series on Super Nintendo, but contrary to popular belief, they were never solely owned by Nintendo. Rare have never been a Nintendo studio. Nintendo did have a 49% stake in the company, but that's not a controlling share. Rare would stick to Nintendo, but they could create whatever they wanted. As the industry made its transition to more defined 3D, Rare needed more development funds, which Nintendo didn't provide, and so Rare began looking for a buyer. Both Activision and Microsoft were interested, but Nintendo was not. They would lose out on one of their biggest partners during that era to Microsoft. It was clear this old approach wasn't going to work anymore. A huge amount of prominent GameCube titles were sent out before they were ready and crunched to meet deadlines. The effects can still be felt in games like Wind Waker, where story and game pacing makes it clear that content was cut. The same is true for titles like Mario Sunshine and Super Smash Bros. Melee, which is popular in spite of its rushed development, although this was handled by HAL and not Nintendo. Perhaps learning from their relationship with Rare and Donkey Kong Country, Nintendo would throw trust into the newly formed Retro Studios to give Metroid a new chance of life with Metroid Prime. 6 months before the release of Prime, Nintendo would end up acquiring the studio for $1 million, but maybe not for the reason you'd expect. Retro Studios had a toxic culture and a lot of heavy crunch. If Retro Studios were to go on, the purchase was necessary. But even though they had Metroid, the GameCube had similar struggles to N64 in juggling the prominent franchises with the smaller ones. Nintendo's resources simply couldn't stretch the ways they could in the past, and so the Game Boy Advance would give us some final echoes of Nintendo R&D developed titles, with games like Wario Land 4 and Metroid Fusion. But in 2003, the late Nintendo president Satoru Iwata made the daring decision to dissolve most of Nintendo's internal studios. R&D 1 and R&D 2 became a single entity called Nintendo Software Planning and Development, or SPD. R&D 3 would become Nintendo IRD and focus solely on hardware and peripherals, leaving R&D 4 as the only prominent in-house Nintendo development team, and they became known as EAD. So for internal development, there's EAD. They'd make Nintendo's most important and successful franchises: Mario, Zelda, Animal Crossing, Pikmin. Miyamoto was part of EAD and he really wanted Pikmin to be a thing. There's a reason there's not much Pikmin these days. Those resources typically go to other games. Every now and then EAD makes brand new IPs like Wii Sports and Nintendogs, but typically it's the big boys like Mario and Zelda. So what is SPD? Well, SPD de-emphasized internal development entirely. Nintendo had learned that partnering with other studios was important, but instead of acquiring them, it could be healthier to simply collaborate, giving each installment a brand new, fresh feeling. SPD would sometimes do their own stuff like the Rhythm Heaven series, but for the most part it was collaboration. They were tightly connected to the WarioWare series, but even that was collaborated with Intelligent Systems. So their main focus was to find teams that could assist in making Nintendo IP. Essentially anything that R&D 1, R&D 2 or R&D 3 made back in the 80s or 90s was now in the hands of SPD finding a third-party team. For the most part, what R&D 4 made was now with EAD, although some franchises like Star Fox still relied on external help. For instance, EAD made Star Fox 64, but Rare made Adventures, Bandai Namco made Assault, Q Games made both Command and 64 3D, and Platinum Games were largely responsible for Star Fox Zero. F-Zero was the same. X was made by EAD, but then Sega made F-Zero GX, while GP Legend and Climax were undertaken by Suzak. Suzak would return to give Wario another platforming chance with Master of Disguise, whereas Goodfield provided a proper land follow-up on the Wii with Shake Dimension. And back on GameCube, Treasure gave us Wario World. Metroid was in the capable hands of the now Nintendo-owned studio, Retro Studios, but only for the Prime series. Series director Sakamoto was trying to get Metroid Dread going for over a decade, but these restructures meant there was no longer a team to make Metroid games internally. If he wanted to make Dread, he would have to find a third-party team to handle development. The first experiment came with Metroid Other M, developed by Koei Tecmo's Team Ninja, but it took Sakamoto until 2015 to find a studio to take on the series with Mercury Steam. They've since done Samus Returns and Dread. No R&D 3 meant no Punch-Out, so after the first game and Super Punch-Out, the series had no one to take care of it internally. Next Level Games would revive the series for a single installment back on the Wii in 2009, but the studio wasn't the permanent home for Punch-Out. They could still do another one, but it has been 13 years. There were definitely benefits to the SPD system, but many franchises found themselves with no developers. And then in 2015, Nintendo consolidated most of its remaining teams into a single entity, Nintendo EPD. EPD is pretty much EAD and SPD rolled into one for more focused development. It's tighter, but nothing's really changed. They're still seeking third parties for development, but if anything, that's gotten tighter too. Under EPD, some of Nintendo's biggest franchises like Mario Kart would also find external collaboration, and we're not just talking about outsourcing a few assets. Bandai Namco have been a highly significant partner for first-party EPD projects and have co-developed several titles. In the past, this would have just been the responsibility of EAD. Projects that were the responsibility of SPD would continue, like Mercury Steam's collaboration on Metroid Dread, or Indie Zero's collaboration on Sushi Striker. EPD itself is made up of 11 different production groups, with some relying on internal development and others external. EPD Group 1 and 2 are external, but Group 3 is the Zelda team. These guys are always making Zelda games. So if you see a new Zelda game gets announced and you wanted something else, there's not really a reality where it'd be something else. These guys only make Zelda. Group 4 is more casual software like Labo, Brain Age, and 1-2-Switch. Group 5 is responsible for Splatoon and Animal Crossing. So if you wondered why New Horizons wasn't a service game that lasted forever, it's because the team went on to Splatoon 3. Group 6 is external development, and Group 7 is a bit of internal and external. They would be responsible for Rhythm Heaven internally, but many other projects are external. Group 8 are the Tokyo Mario guys. They're responsible for Odyssey, 3D World, Captain Toad. Group 9 is Mario Kart, ARMS, Nintendogs. Group 10 does 2D Mario and also Pikmin. And then finally Group 11 is mobile external. So basically internally Nintendo make 3D Mario, 2D Mario, Mario Kart, Zelda, Animal Crossing, Splatoon, Pikmin, Rhythm Heaven, and a few smaller experimental franchises. Everything else needs a third-party collaboration. But of course EPD isn't everything, there are other Nintendo studios. ND Cube work on the Mario Party series but also gave us Clubhouse games. Retro Studios have done Metroid Prime and Donkey Kong Country. Next Level Games have done Luigi's Mansion, Mario Strikers, and Punch-Out. Monolith Software are first party, and they do Xenoblade. They're also treated as an asset house for EPD, so many EPD projects like Splatoon, Animal Crossing, and Zelda. Nerd, or Nintendo European Research and Development, handle much of the emulation work, and there's studios like Nintendo Software Technology, or NST. They have developed some larger games like Wave Race Blue Storm and Metroid Prime Hunters, but they've fallen into smaller scale projects in the last decade and a half, mostly relying on Mario vs. Donkey Kong and assisting with other projects. But what about HAL Laboratory? Well, they're actually not owned by Nintendo. They are independent, and if they like, they can publish their own titles independently of Nintendo, like Part-Time UFO. This was on mobile 3 years before the Switch version. Despite this, since the NES and Game Boy, HAL have been a loyal partner to Nintendo. They're pretty much always making a constant flow of Kirby games. Kirby's owned under Warp Star Incorporated, and this company is owned 50% by Nintendo and 50% by HAL. Both companies equally share Kirby. So this is why HAL constantly make Kirby games. It's their IP. They wouldn't make Pikmin or F-Zero because they wouldn't make as much money from those franchises. Also, merch. Kirby is a very big merch item. Intelligent Systems is in a very similar position. They are not owned by Nintendo, but they work very, very closely with them. They've never made a game that isn't in partnership with Nintendo, and they've made dev kits for Nintendo systems. Many think they're part of Nintendo, and I would understand why, but they are legally not. These guys are mostly known for WarioWare, Paper Mario, Advance Wars, and Fire Emblem. And Fire Emblem's a similar case to Kirby. They made it themselves, and it's their most flexible IP. It is owned by Nintendo, but Intelligent Systems will pretty much always be making a new one. Camelot are also not owned by Nintendo, and made their debut with Sega, offering the Shining Force series. They then partnered with PlayStation for Hot Shots Golf or Everybody's Golf, and lastly partnered with Nintendo for Mario Golf and Mario Tennis. Their experience with Shining Force led to another fantasy series, being Golden Sun, but the Mario Sports titles are more financially successful opportunities. In fact, during the Wii era, Wii Sports was so successful that no Mario Sports game that overlaps with the key sports of Wii Sports got developed. And so Camelot found themselves partnering with Capcom for We Love Golf, which was pretty much just Mario Golf with no Mario. Golden Sun did later appear on DS, but Camelot needed their golf money. And so how? Intelligent Systems and Camelot can do that at any point. They can go off and work with someone else, but they typically don't because Nintendo is their best customer. Game Freak's an interesting one. Nintendo have co-ownership of the Pokemon Company. It's owned 33% by Nintendo, 33% by Game Freak, and 33% by Creatures. But Nintendo also have shares in both Creatures and Game Freak, just not controlling ones, but enough for Pokemon to never leave Nintendo home consoles. However, Game Freak as a studio outside of Pokemon is still independent. Non-Pokemon games like Little Town Hero can still go to PlayStation 4. And in the very amusing case of Tembo the Badass Elephant, it can skip Nintendo entirely. Even Game Freak didn't care about the Wii U. But this does also mean that Game Freak will pretty much always develop Pokemon. Ilka did develop Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, but that decision would have partially come from Game Freak. So all this is to say that there's a legacy franchise developed by R&D 1, R&D 2, R&D 3, or in some cases R&D 4 that you want back? You better hope a third party's not only interested, but has the resources and scheduling to commit to the project. Kid Icarus Uprising wouldn't have returned if Sakurai hadn't formed Sora Limited. Every time there's a new Smash, there needs to be a developer handy like Bandai Namco. Nintendo are unlikely to ever make a new F-Zero internally. Our best bet at this point is a studio like Arika for F-Zero 99. This isn't to say all those franchises are doomed to forever be in limbo, but right now, there are no teams for them. It also means when Nintendo put out a bunch of Kirby games and Zelda games and Splatoon games, those resources aren't taking away from those other IP. Those EPD groups were formed just for those IP. For something like Eternal Darkness or Murasame Castle to return, there needs to be an external team ready and waiting. One really cool one recently was Famicom Detective Club with Majors. They did an awesome job. Although some partnerships have fallen apart, like Monster Games who gave the Excite series a brilliant new life. They also did Pilotwings Resort, but after that, they just suddenly stopped working with Nintendo, and eventually got acquired by iRacing.com. I know some of you guys know this stuff anyway, but I thought because not all of us follow the inner workings of the industry, this could be interesting to some people. So thanks for watching this whole thing, I really appreciate it, and I'm gonna go back to babbling about games no one really cares about. Thanks for watching, everyone!